The sun was barely climbing over the manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks of Fairhaven Grove. Marcus Bennett stood in the front yard of his newly purchased house, his hands covered in dirt as he carefully planted a row of roses along the white picket fence. The morning was crisp, the air fragrant with the beginnings of spring, and for a moment, it felt like a fresh start. "This is it," Marcus whispered to himself, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He turned to look at the house. 2 stories of colonial charm with navy blue shutters and a spacious front porch. It was the kind of home he dreamed of for his family since he was a boy growing up in a cramped apartment. Cynthia, his wife, had cried when they signed the final paperwork. Their daughter, Lila, had already claimed her favorite corner of the backyard for a swing set. Marcus had worked for this. Long nights at the firm, missed holidays, and years of enduring subtle exclusions in rooms where he was always the only one. As he organized the last few boxes delivered earlier that morning, Marcus heard a door slam across the street. He turned his head slightly and spotted a man, middle-aged, balding, wearing cargo shorts and a Harvard sweatshirt, standing on his porch with arms folded. The man watched Marcus with an expression that immediately put him on edge. "Morning," Marcus called out, forcing a friendly smile. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stared for a beat longer before retreating inside. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head as he muttered under his breath. So much for neighborly charm. He shrugged it off, determined not to let anything ruin this day. Minutes later, as Marcus bent down to open another box, he heard it, the slow rumble of a car pulling into the driveway. He glanced up and froze. A patrol car. Its black and white frame seemed to loom larger than life against the quiet street, the red and blue lights flashing silently. Marcus straightened, his heartbeat quickening as the driver's side door opened. Out stepped Officer Brady Thompson. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stoic face carved from years of experience. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the morning sun, obscuring his eyes as he approached with a hand resting casually on his belt. "Good morning," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "Can I help you, officer?" Brady didn't answer right away. He scanned the yard slowly. The moving boxes, Marcus's dirt-streaked clothes, the house behind him. "We got a call," Brady said finally, his voice measured and flat. "A report of a suspicious man on this property." Marcus blinked, confusion settling in. "Excuse me? Suspicious? I live here. This is my house." Brady tilted his head. "Is that so?" "Yes," Marcus replied, his tone sharpening. "I bought this house. My name is Marcus Bennett. I'm an attorney downtown. This is my property." Brady's hand moved to his sunglasses, sliding them off and tucking them into his shirt pocket. For the first time, Marcus could see his eyes, sharp, searching, and above all, skeptical. "Do you have any ID on you?" Marcus clenched his jaw, the request feeling like a slap. "I'm outside working in my yard. My wallet is inside. You want me to go get it?" Brady's lips pressed into a thin line. "I need you to step over here, sir." "Step where?" Marcus demanded, incredulous. "This is my property." "What's going on here?" Brady's voice dropped, stern and unyielding. "Sir, I'm going to need you to comply. Step away from the house." A sick feeling knotted in Marcus's stomach. He glanced around, hoping to see anyone who might step in and help make sense of this madness. Across the street, he saw movement. The same neighbor who'd been watching earlier was now standing at his window, phone in hand. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. He called the police. Marcus took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "Officer, you're making a mistake. I told you I live here. Look inside. There are boxes everywhere. My name's on the paperwork." Brady stepped closer, his presence looming now. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again. Hands where I can see them." "You can't be serious," Marcus muttered, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't even know." The sentence died in his throat as Brady reached for his cuffs. Before Marcus could react, Brady grabbed his arm and spun him around. The cold, unforgiving bite of steel closed around his wrists. "Wait! What the hell are you doing?" Marcus shouted, twisting instinctively before being shoved forward. "You're being detained," Brady said. "For what?" Marcus's voice cracked, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. "This is my house. My family lives here." "Stop resisting," Brady snapped, tightening the cuffs. "I'm not resisting," Marcus yelled, his words drowned by the sound of his own pulse thundering in his ears. He felt the heat of the moment boil over. The helplessness, the rage, the shock of being handled this way in broad daylight. The street was no longer quiet. A woman stood at the end of her driveway, whispering into her phone. Another man stepped outside, arms crossed as he watched with interest. Marcus turned his head slightly and saw something that made his heart sink further. A teenager, maybe 15, maybe 16, holding up a phone, camera trained on the scene. "Call my wife," Marcus shouted, searching for anyone who might listen. "Call Cynthia Bennett. She's inside." "I live here." "Stay calm," Brady ordered, pulling Marcus toward the patrol car. "I am calm," Marcus shot back, his voice ragged. "This is unbelievable. You're humiliating me." Brady didn't respond. The officer opened the back door of the car and guided Marcus inside with a hand on his head, as though he were a criminal. Through the window, Marcus could see the house, his house, looming in the distance, now a cruel symbol of everything he'd tried to overcome. By the time Brady returned to his car to run Marcus's name, the street was buzzing with whispers. Marcus sat in the back seat, hands trembling against the cuffs as he stared out the window. He watched as Cynthia stepped onto the porch, her face a mask of confusion and horror as she took in the scene. "Marcus," she called, her voice high-pitched. "What's going on?" Marcus turned his head, unable to do anything but watch as the nightmare unfolded. "Ma'am, do you live here?" Brady asked, walking up to her. "Of course I do. That's my husband," Cynthia yelled, her voice cracking. The officer paused, his hand going to the radio on his shoulder. "Stand by," he muttered. A few moments later, the confirmation came through. Marcus Bennett, homeowner. Attorney. No record. The realization flickered across Brady's face, but he didn't look back toward the patrol car. He didn't meet Marcus's eyes when he opened the door and unfastened the cuffs. "Looks like there was a misunderstanding," Brady said stiffly. Marcus stared at him, his wrists raw and red. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What was there to say? From somewhere down the street, the voice of the teenager broke the silence. "I got the whole thing on video." What should have been the proudest day of Marcus Bennett's life now lay in ruins. And as he stood there, hands shaking, the neighbors watching, one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The hum of voices lingered in the air long after Officer Brady Thompson had driven away, leaving Marcus standing in the middle of his front yard, wrists still tingling from the handcuffs. Cynthia was beside him, her expression a mix of disbelief and rage, her arms folded tightly across her chest as if holding herself together. "Marcus," she said softly, though the anger in her voice was palpable. "What just happened?" Marcus swallowed hard, trying to push down the humiliation that burned in his chest. He said someone called the cops. Said I was suspicious. Suspicious? Cynthia's voice rose. Suspicious for what, Marcus? Planting roses? Unpacking boxes? "Oh, I know. You were guilty of existing in your own front yard." "See when," Marcus began, his voice low, but Cynthia wasn't finished. "And he handcuffed you, Marcus." She turned toward the street, as if searching for a target to unleash her fury on. A few neighbors were still outside, lingering at the edges of their driveways or watching from behind curtains. Some looked away when her gaze met theirs, but a few had the audacity to keep staring. Marcus put a hand on her arm. "It's over now." "Over?" Cynthia jerked away from him. "No, it's not over. This man, this cop, humiliated you in front of our neighbors. In front of Lila." At the sound of their daughter's name, Marcus's head snapped toward the house. Lila was peeking through the window, her small hands pressed to the glass, her eyes wide and scared. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He had worked his entire life to protect his family from moments like this. "I'll go talk to her," Cynthia said, her voice trembling now as the adrenaline wore off. She's probably terrified. Marcus nodded, forcing himself to breathe. I'll handle this. He gestured vaguely toward the empty street, though he wasn't sure what this even meant. As Cynthia disappeared into the house, Marcus felt the weight of eyes on him. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and spotted the neighbor across the street, the same man in the Harvard sweatshirt, standing on his porch with an iced coffee in hand. For a moment, Marcus considered letting it go. Walk back inside. Keep the peace. But then he remembered the feeling of Brady's hands on his wrists, the cold steel of the cuffs, the way the officer hadn't even listened to him. He thought about Lila watching from the window. Marcus walked across the street. The man didn't move as Marcus approached, but a smug, barely there smirk tugged at his mouth. Morning, the neighbor said casually, as if nothing had happened. Marcus stopped at the base of the porch steps, hands on his hips. Did you call the police? The man took a slow sip of his coffee. I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the crap, Marcus snapped, his voice low but sharp. I saw you watching me earlier. You called them, didn't you? Told them I looked suspicious. The neighbor raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. You looked out of place, is all. I didn't recognize you. Just being cautious. Out of place. Marcus repeated, disbelief ringing in his voice. I was planting flowers. On my own property. What about that looked suspicious to you? The neighbor shrugged, the smirk now full on his face. Like I said, I was being cautious. You can't be too careful these days. Marcus stepped forward, his voice trembling with restrained anger. Listen to me very carefully. I live here. I bought that house with my own money. Money I worked damn hard to earn. You don't get to decide who belongs here. The neighbor's smile faltered, but only for a moment. You don't need to get so worked up. If it's your house, then there's no harm done, right? Marcus stared at him, incredulous. No harm done? You had me handcuffed on my own lawn. My daughter watched me get treated like a criminal because you couldn't be bothered to mind your own business. A voice interrupted them. Everything okay over here? Marcus turned to see another neighbor, an older woman with short gray hair and a pink gardening hat, standing a few feet away. She held a watering can, though it was clear she wasn't actually using it. She was eavesdropping. Oh, we're fine, Mrs. Robbins, the man in the Harvard sweatshirt said smoothly. Just a misunderstanding. Mrs. Robbins looked at Marcus, her expression pinched and wary. You're the new owner, aren't you? Marcus let out a slow breath, forcing himself to calm down. Yes, ma'am. Marcus Bennett. He offered his hand, but Mrs. Robbins didn't take it. Instead, she glanced at the man on the porch before nodding faintly and hurrying back toward her own yard. Marcus turned back to his neighbor, his jaw tight. You're pathetic, he said quietly. The man's smirk returned. Welcome to the neighborhood. Back inside his house, Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, staring blankly at the floor. Cynthia sat at the table with Lila in her lap, stroking the little girl's hair as she whispered soothing words. Daddy. Lila's voice was small, timid. Marcus forced himself to smile as he knelt beside her. Hey, sweetheart. Everything's okay now. Why did the police take you? She asked, her big brown eyes searching his face. Did you do something bad? The question hit him harder than he expected. He glanced at Cynthia, who looked just as stricken as he felt. No, baby, Marcus said softly, taking Lila's tiny hand in his. Daddy didn't do anything bad. Sometimes people make mistakes. That's all it was. But why you? Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. How could he explain to his 6-year-old daughter that some people would always see him as less, no matter what he did? That he could be a respected lawyer, a homeowner, and a good man, and it still wouldn't matter? Cynthia spoke up, her voice gentle. Because not everyone knows Daddy yet, sweetie. But they will. They'll see how wonderful he is. And we'll make sure of it, okay? Lila nodded, her little face still troubled, but she leaned into her mother's arms. Marcus stood and turned toward the window, his hands clenching at his sides as he watched the street. He could still see the neighbor's porch from here. Welcome to the neighborhood. The words echoed in his head like a taunt. Marcus knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The days that followed the incident were heavy with an uncomfortable silence. Marcus tried to move on, burying himself in work during the day and doing his best to be present for his family at night. But no matter how hard he tried, the memory of the handcuffs and Brady Thompson's cold, skeptical eyes kept him awake at night. Worse, the neighborhood had begun to feel like a stage where every movement he made was under scrutiny. When Marcus went outside to collect the mail or water the flowers, he'd catch glimpses of curtains shifting or eyes peeking out from windows. Even the simplest actions felt weighted. He knew what they were thinking. There's the man from the video. Because, of course, the video had gone viral. The teenager who recorded it had uploaded the footage, complete with a caption that read, "This is what being black in America looks like." Man handcuffed in front of his own house. By the time Marcus found out about it, it had already amassed thousands of views. He avoided the comment section, but Cynthia wasn't as disciplined. "They're calling you a liar," she said one night, phone in hand, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "Some of them think you were trespassing. Others are saying you deserved it because the cop was just doing his job." Marcus sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "Stop reading that garbage, CYN. It's not worth it." "It is worth it," she shot back. "This is what people really think about us. About you. You're a lawyer, Marcus. You've done everything right." And still, her voice broke slightly, but she swallowed it down. "It's like nothing you do matters." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. She wasn't wrong. It all came to a head the following Saturday when Marcus received an unexpected phone call. "Mr. Bennett, this is Detective Carla Reyes with the Internal Affairs Division. I'd like to discuss the incident that occurred last week involving Officer Brady Thompson." Marcus hesitated, phone pressed to his ear. "I've already told my story. I don't know what else you need." "Mr. Bennett, I understand," Reyes replied, her voice calm but firm. "But the department has launched an investigation into Officer Thompson's conduct, and your statement is crucial." Marcus closed his eyes. An investigation. As much as he wanted justice, the thought of being dragged back into this mess made his stomach twist. He could already imagine the backlash, whispers in the community, a target on his back. But he knew what would happen if he stayed silent. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll talk." The meeting took place at a neutral location, a sterile office space downtown, far from the Fairhaven Grove community. Cynthia insisted on coming along, though she waited in the car while Marcus sat across from Detective Reyes, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp features and a watchful gaze. "Let's start from the beginning," she said, clicking on a recorder. "Tell me everything that happened that morning." Marcus recounted the incident in detail, his planting flowers, the patrol car pulling up, Brady's refusal to listen to his explanations, and the handcuffs. His voice was steady, but he could feel the emotion creeping in the longer he spoke. "And what did Officer Thompson say to you during this encounter?" Reyes asked. "He said they'd received a call about a suspicious man on my property," Marcus replied, his voice tightening. "But he never gave me the benefit of the doubt. Never looked at the boxes. Never asked for proof. He decided who I was before I even opened my mouth." Reyes scribbled something in her notebook. "And you believe this call was made maliciously?" Marcus hesitated. The neighbor's smug face flashed in his mind. "I know it was." Reyes leaned forward slightly. "Can you elaborate on that?" "There's a man across the street, James Callahan. He watched me from his porch that morning. He's the one who called." "Do you have proof of that?" Marcus's jaw tightened.
"No."
"But I know it was him. He's been staring me down since the day we moved in. There's history there. Years ago, I represented a tenant who filed a lawsuit against his father's real estate company. It cost them a lot of money. He knows exactly who I am." Reyes looked at him thoughtfully, her pen hovering over her notebook. "Interesting. What happens to Officer Thompson now?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. "An investigation will determine if he violated department policy," Reyes said carefully. "But, Mr. Bennett, I have to warn you, cases like this don't always end the way you'd hope." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. Believe me, detective. I know. As they drove home, Cynthia glanced at Marcus from the passenger seat. How'd it go? Same as always, Marcus replied, his voice tight. They'll investigate, but I'm not holding my breath. Cynthia was quiet for a moment before she said softly, You did the right thing, Marcus? Did I? Marcus muttered, gripping the steering wheel. Or did I just make it worse? The following evening, Marcus was in his home office when he heard the faint knock at the front door. Cynthia called for him from the living room. Marcus, it's for you. He stepped out and froze when he saw who was standing in the doorway. Officer Brady Thompson. He was out of uniform, wearing jeans and a plain button-down shirt. His posture was stiff, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. What are you doing here? Marcus asked, his voice cold. Brady cleared his throat. I wanted to talk. Marcus's first instinct was to slam the door in his face, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in Brady's eyes. Something guarded, uncomfortable, almost ashamed. Talk. Marcus repeated. Why would I want to talk to you? Because I owe you an apology, Brady said, his voice strained, as though the words were foreign to him. Marcus stared at him, the silence heavy between them. Finally, he stepped aside. 5 minutes. Brady walked into the living room, his gaze darting around the space before settling on Marcus. He looked out of place, like a man who didn't belong. I messed up, Brady said finally, his voice low. That day, I saw you and I didn't handle it right. Marcus crossed his arms. You humiliated me. In front of my wife, my daughter, my neighbors. And you're just now realizing you messed up? Brady's jaw twitched. I'm not proud of what I did, but I want to understand why I did it. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. What's that supposed to mean? I mean, Brady shifted uncomfortably. Maybe I've been walking around with blinders on. I thought I was just doing my job. But maybe there's more to it. Maybe it's me that's the problem. Marcus studied him carefully, searching for signs of insincerity. For the first time, Brady Thompson looked less like the cold officer from that morning and more like a man grappling with something unfamiliar. I don't need your guilt, Marcus said finally. I need change. What are you actually going to do about it? Brady looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze directly. I don't know yet, but I'm trying. Marcus let out a slow breath, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Trying isn't enough. I know, Brady replied quietly. And for the first time, Marcus wondered if maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story. The days after Officer Brady Thompson's visit weighed on Marcus like a lead blanket. His words, maybe I've been walking around with blinders on, looped in Marcus's mind, a mixture of reluctant surprise and frustration. It wasn't enough. Nothing ever seemed to be enough. Fairhaven Grove continued its quiet hum of suburban life, but for Marcus, the stillness felt suffocating. The neighbors who once seemed indifferent now shifted uncomfortably when they saw him. James Callahan still watched from his porch, his smug face a constant reminder of the humiliation Marcus endured. Morning, Marcus. James called casually one day as Marcus brought the trash bins to the curb. Marcus stopped, his hands gripping the bin handles tightly. He turned, forcing himself to remain calm. What do you want, James? James shrugged, holding a mug of coffee. Nothing. Just being neighborly. Neighborly? Marcus let out a bitter laugh. You're the reason this all started. I know you called the police on me. James raised an eyebrow, playing the innocent game again. Oh? Prove it. Marcus stepped forward. I don't need to prove anything to you. I know who you are, and I know exactly why you did it. James's smug smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. You don't belong here, Bennett. Not in this neighborhood. Not in that house. The words hung in the air, heavy and vicious. Marcus's fists tightened at his sides. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to respond, to lash out, but he forced himself to breathe. He wouldn't give James the satisfaction. You don't get to decide where I belong, Marcus said quietly. Enjoy your coffee, James. With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, his heart pounding with fury. Inside, Cynthia was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone with a furrowed brow. "Have you seen this?" she asked as Marcus came in, still visibly shaken. "What now?" Marcus sighed. She turned the phone toward him. On the screen was a news article with the headline, "Viral video sparks community outrage. Homeowner wrongfully detained." Beneath the headline was a screenshot from the now infamous video. Marcus felt his stomach twist at the sight of himself, handcuffed, vulnerable, humiliated. "They're holding a town meeting," Cynthia said, her tone serious. "The city council wants to address everything." Marcus shook his head. "A town meeting? What's that going to solve?" "It's something," Cynthia countered. "Marcus, people are talking about what happened to you. About what happened here. Maybe this is an opportunity to say something. To make them listen." Marcus rubbed his forehead. "See why, and I'm tired. I'm so damn tired of having to explain myself. Of having to prove to people that I belong here." She stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "I know. But if you don't speak up, who will? What about Lila? What about the people who look at you as proof that it's possible to fight back and move forwards?" Marcus looked into her eyes and saw the truth in her words. Cynthia was right. Staying silent would only allow people like James Callahan to win. "Fine," Marcus muttered. "I'll go to the meeting." The town hall meeting was held in the Fairhaven Grove Community Center, a brick building with large windows and folding chairs arranged in rows. By the time Marcus and Cynthia arrived, the room was already filling up. Marcus spotted Brady Thompson near the back, standing stiffly with his hands in his pockets, his gaze focused on the floor. The sight of him brought a sour taste to Marcus's mouth. The murmurs in the room quieted as the city council members sat at a long table on a makeshift stage. The chairwoman, a stern woman in her 60s, adjusted her microphone. "We're here tonight," she began, "because of an incident that occurred last week, a troubling incident that has sparked questions about fairness, trust, and safety in our community." Marcus listened as the chairwoman spoke, his eyes scanning the crowd. There were people from all over Fairhaven Grove, families, seniors, teenagers. James Callahan was there, sitting near the front with his arms folded across his chest. When the floor was opened for community comments, a woman in a pink blouse was the first to speak. "This neighborhood has always been peaceful," she said. "We've never had problems before. I think it's important to recognize that Officer Thompson was just doing his job." Marcus's jaw tightened, his fists curling against his sides. Another voice chimed in, a young black man who stood near the back. "Doing his job? You think handcuffing a homeowner on his own property is just doing his jobs? Come on." The room rippled with murmurs as the young man sat down. Marcus could feel his heart pounding. He didn't want to speak. He didn't want to stand up and lay his soul bare for strangers who wouldn't understand. But then he felt Cynthia's hand on his knee. "Marcus," she whispered. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stood. The room quieted as he walked to the microphone. "My name is Marcus Bennett," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves clawing at his chest. "I'm an attorney, a husband, a father, and I live here, right here in Fairhaven Grove. A few days ago, I was handcuffed on my front lawn, for no reason other than someone deciding that I didn't belong." He looked out at the crowd, his gaze landing briefly on James Callahan, whose expression was impassive. "I moved my family here because I believed this was a place where we could thrive, where my daughter could grow up feeling safe, valued, and seen. But what happened to me proves that no matter how much you achieve, no matter how much you earn, there are still people who will look at you and only see what they want to see." A hush fell over the room. Marcus's voice rose slightly, carrying the weight of his emotion. "This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been judged unfairly, who's been made to feel like they don't belong. And it's about a system that allows these assumptions to go unchecked." From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw Brady Thompson looking up at him, his face unreadable. "I'm not here to blame this community," Marcus continued, his voice softening. "I'm here to challenge it. To challenge you. To look at the ways we allow prejudice to seep into our lives, into our actions, and into our assumptions. Because until we face it, until we see it, nothing will change." He stepped back from the microphone. For a moment, the room was silent. Then slowly someone began clapping. Marcus looked up and saw the young man from earlier, the one who'd spoken up for him, applauding. A few more hands joined in. Not everyone clapped. James Callahan sat still, his arms crossed tightly, his expression sour. But it didn't matter. Marcus had spoken his truth. As Marcus returned to his seat, Cynthia squeezed his hand tightly. "You did good," she whispered. Marcus nodded, but he knew the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning of something much larger than himself. After the meeting, as Marcus and Cynthia walked toward the exit, Brady Thompson approached them, his expression hesitant. "That was powerful," Brady said, his voice awkward. Marcus stared at him for a moment, his face unreadable. It needed to be said. Brady shifted, as if grappling with something. "I'm listening. For what it's worth." Marcus nodded curtly. "Keep listening. And start acting." Brady's gaze fell to the floor, and for the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of something real, a crack in the man's stoic facade. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Cynthia looped her arm through Marcus's. "You think he'll change?" Marcus looked up at the darkened sky. "I don't know. But maybe someone will." The weeks following the town hall meeting were a whirlwind of emotion and transformation. Marcus's speech had struck a nerve, not just with the people in the room, but with the larger community. The video of his statement had spread across social media, drawing local media attention and sparking a larger conversation about race, bias, and belonging in Fairhaven Grove. The first noticeable change was the silence. Neighbors who once watched Marcus with thinly veiled suspicion now avoided eye contact. Some seemed ashamed, others looked defensive, unwilling to engage. But there were also those who approached him, not with excuses or platitudes, but with genuine attempts to connect. One morning, as Marcus was retrieving the newspaper, Mrs. Robbins, the woman who'd ignored his handshake, walked across the street. She carried a tray of cookies, her hands shaking slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she said nervously. Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Morning." She held out the tray. "I baked these. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I acted. I didn't know you, and I should have been better. I'm trying to be better." Marcus studied her for a moment before accepting the cookies. "Thank you, Mrs. Robbins." The older woman nodded, her eyes softening. "My husband always said the neighborhood was fine as it was. But maybe it wasn't so fine. Maybe we just weren't looking." Marcus watched her walk back to her house and felt the weight of her words settle over him. People were starting to see. Maybe not everyone, but enough to give him hope. Meanwhile, Officer Brady Thompson's investigation had concluded. While the department didn't terminate him, Brady was placed on mandatory training and community outreach programs. He also made a choice, one no one forced him to make. He showed up at Marcus's doorstep one evening, a paper bag in hand. "Brady," Marcus said flatly, holding the door open just a crack. "What are you doing here?" Brady shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "I didn't come here to defend myself or to make excuses. I've been working with some community programs. I'm trying to listen, to learn." He hesitated. "I thought you might want to see this." He handed Marcus the bag. Inside was a small pamphlet titled Bias and Trust Building in Policing and a handwritten letter. Marcus looked at him warily. "And what am I supposed to do with this?" Brady exhaled. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Mr. Bennett. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying. And not because I have to, but because I need to." Marcus studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But Brady's face was open, unguarded in a way Marcus had never seen before. Finally, Marcus nodded. "Keep trying?" Brady nodded back, almost as if it were a promise. The real change, however, came from Marcus himself. The humiliation he'd endured had broken something in him, but it also lit a fire that refused to burn out. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus stood at the front of the Fairhaven Grove Community Center again. This time, the hall was full, not for a town meeting, but for something Marcus had organized himself, a community dialogue for change. Cynthia sat in the front row, beaming with pride, while Lila played quietly in the corner with a coloring book. People from all over the neighborhood were there, young, old, black, white, and everything in between. Even Brady sat quietly in the back, listening. Marcus looked out at the crowd and took a deep breath. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "When I moved to this neighborhood, I thought I'd finally achieved a dream. A house, a quiet street, a safe place to raise my daughter." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "But what happened to me reminded me of something important, that a house doesn't make a home. A community does. And that requires trust, empathy, and understanding, things we can only achieve if we're willing to have hard conversations." He gestured to the small group of panelists behind him, community leaders, educators, and even a few police officers. Today is about starting those conversations. It's about listening to each other, challenging our biases, and building something better. Not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Marcus smiled faintly, the weight on his chest lifting slightly. As the discussions began, Marcus watched people open up, neighbors who'd never spoken to one another sharing stories, asking questions, and acknowledging truths that had long been ignored. At one point, James Callahan entered the room. Marcus felt the familiar pang of anger in his chest, but he didn't let it consume him. Instead, he nodded to James, who hesitated before finding a seat in the back. Cynthia leaned over and whispered in Marcus's ear. Even he came. Marcus nodded. One step at a time. Weeks turned into months. The roses Marcus had planted in his yard bloomed, their bright red petals a striking contrast to the white picket fence. Lila played on the swing set in the backyard, her laughter echoing through the air. One evening, as Marcus sat on the porch watching the sunset, he spotted James Callahan across the street. This time, James didn't linger on his porch. He nodded faintly in acknowledgement before stepping inside. "Progress?" Cynthia asked, sitting beside Marcus with 2 mugs of tea. Marcus smiled softly. "Maybe." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know, I think Lila's going to grow up in a better neighborhood than the one we moved into. That's the goal," Marcus murmured. The sound of Lila's giggles drifted toward them again, and Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the peace wash over him. He thought about everything they'd endured, the humiliation, the anger, the fear, and how, somehow, they'd turned it into something meaningful. Change didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, with hard conversations, difficult truths, and small steps forward. But it came, and that was enough. For now.